I always loved being home alone. At 17, it gave me a sense of independence that I craved as the youngest of four siblings. The Saturday night was no exception. My parents were at a charity gala downtown, my older brothers were off at college, and my sister was spending the weekend with friends. I had the whole house to myself, a rare and a precious thing. Our house was an old house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods that stretched out for miles. During the day, it was charming, with creaky floors and old paintings. At night, it was another story entirely. Shadows pooled in the corners, and every little noise felt magnified, like the house was alive. I was laying on the couch, halfway through a crime documentary, when the power went out. The TV flickered off, plunging the room into darkness. The hum of the refrigerator died. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hitting the windows. "No big deal," I muttered, fumbling for my phone. I flicked on the flashlight and made my way to the kitchen to grab candles. The storm outside must have knocked out the power. It happened often enough. As I lit the candles and arranged them around the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just a storm. It was too quiet. Normally the woods around the house buzzed with nocturnal life. Crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of a deer. But that night, there was nothing. Just the relentless tap of rain and the wind moaning through the trees. I told myself I was being silly. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I settled back on the couch and tried to focus on my phone, scrolling through social media to distract myself. But that's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound. It was so soft I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. It was coming from the back door. My heart thudded in my chest. I stared towards the kitchen, where the back door was located. The house was still, the candlelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Probably just a branch," I whispered, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Branches didn't make deliberate, rhythmic scraping sounds like that. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed towards the kitchen, my socks silent on the hardwood floor. The closer I got, the more distinct the sound became. It wasn't a branch. It was metallic, like someone jiggling the handle. My breath hitched. My parents always locked the doors before leaving, but what if they had forgotten this time? "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The scraping stopped. I stood frozen, the only sound being my pounding heart. Then, the knob twisted. I didn't think. I ran to the door and flipped the deadbolt, pressing my weight against the door. Whoever was on the other side shoved hard, the door rattling in its frame. "Go away," I screamed, my voice raw. The shoving stopped abruptly. For a moment, all was silent. Then came the sound of retreating footsteps. I stood there, shaking, my back against the door. Minutes passed, but I couldn't bring myself to move. When I finally did, it was to grab a kitchen knife and call 911. The dispatcher's calm voice steadied me as I explained what had happened. She assured me that a patrol car was on the way. I stayed on the line, clutching the knife in one hand and my phone in the other, huddled in the corner of the kitchen. The officers arrived within 10 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. They searched the property, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. When they came back inside, they told me they had found muddy footprints leading from the woods to the back door. Whoever it was had disappeared into the trees before they arrived. My parents came home shortly after the police left. My mom was frantic, hugging me so tightly I could barely breathe. My dad walked the perimeter of the house with a flashlight, muttering about installing cameras and stronger locks. That night, I slept in my parents' room, but I barely closed my eyes. Every creak, every groan of the house set my nerves on edge. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure at the door, their intentions, their persistence. They hadn't just stumbled upon our house. They'd been determined to get in. The power in the house had been acting up all day, lights flickering, appliances shutting off randomly, and I was beginning to regret my decision to stay alone in the place. The house, a Victorian behemoth that I inherited from my grandmother, it had always given me mixed feelings. It was beautiful in its old, weathered way, but it creaked and groaned as if it had a life of its own. By the time I finally gave in and called an electrician, it was already close to 9:30 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone to actually come that late, but when the man on the other end of the line said he could be there in 20 minutes, I was too relieved to second guess it. At exactly 10 p.m., a van pulled up outside. The man who stepped out looked like he had been doing this job for decades. He had a skinny frame, a heavy work jacket, and a face that seemed permanently shadowed, even in the glow of the porch light. "Evening," he said, with a curt nod as I opened the door. "Thanks for coming so late," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He followed me to the basement where the breaker box was. I kept a polite distance, letting him do his work while he muttered things like, "Old wiring, seen better days." We made small talk, mostly me explaining the house's quirks. He asked a few questions, his eyes lingering on me a little too long at times. I told myself it was just my imagination. "It's a nice place," he said after a while. "Got a lot of history, huh?" "Yeah, it's been in my family for generations," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Well," he said after another 5 minutes, snapping his toolbox shut, "I've done what I can for tonight. It's too late to finish everything. I'll have to come back tomorrow." "That's fine," I said, already eager to see him leave. I walked him to the door, watching as he got into his van and drove off. I locked the door behind him and double-checked it. The house was quiet again, but something about the interaction left me uneasy. About an hour later, I was curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint tap on the window. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It's just the wind, I thought, but when I glanced toward the window, my blood ran cold. He was there, the electrician. He was just standing outside, staring at me. His face was pale in the moonlight, his eyes wide and unblinking, his expression blank, but unnervingly intense. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then, instinct kicked in, and I bolted from the living room, my tea spilling onto the floor. My hands were trembling as I locked myself in the bedroom. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering frantically into the receiver. "There's a man outside my house," I said. "He was here earlier to fix the power, but now he's just staring through the window." The dispatcher's voice was calm and reassuring, but it felt like an eternity before the promise that help was on the way. I crawled under my bed, clutching my phone tightly. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it, even from outside. But then I heard footsteps. My stomach dropped. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the house. How? I was certain I'd locked the doors after he left. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside my bedroom. I could see his shadow under the door. The doorknob turned slowly, the door creaking open. I held my breath, my body frozen in terror. From my vantage point under the bed, I could see his boots step into the room. He was muttering something under his breath, but the words were too low to make out. He stood there for what felt like forever before he finally turned and left, closing the door behind him. I stayed under the bed, barely breathing, until I heard the distant sound of sirens. When the police arrived, they searched the entire house. I told them everything, about the electrician, the tapping on the window, the footsteps. But there was no sign of him, no sign of forced entry. like he had vanished. One of the officers suggested that I might have imagined it, maybe spooked myself in the old house. But I knew what I saw, and I knew what I heard. I didn't sleep there that night. I packed a bag and stayed at a friend's place. The next day, I called the electrical company to follow up. When I described the man who had come, the person on the other end of the line was hesitated. "We don't have anyone who matches that description," they said. "And we don't send technicians out that late." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. I never stayed alone in that house again. And to this day, I can still see his face in my mind. The pale skin, the wide, unblinking eyes, the way he stared like he wasn't entirely human. Whoever or whatever he was, I never saw him again. The night started as a rare treat. My parents had gone to a weekend retreat in the mountains, leaving me, a 16-year-old homebody, in charge of the house. I had big plans: microwave popcorn, a stack of movies, and my favorite fuzzy blanket. Our house was modest, but very cozy, located in a quiet suburb. It was the perfect place for a night of relaxation. I decided to make some tea to warm up. Standing in the kitchen, I noticed something strange. The back door's motion light flickered on. It was unusual. Sometimes a stray cat or a raccoon set it off. But this time, there was no movement. No animal darting through the yard. Just an empty yard, exposed under the pale light. I stared for a moment longer, my unease growing, before dismissing it as a coincidence. Maybe the wind had set it off. Returning to the living room, I wrapped myself in a blanket and started the next movie. 15 minutes later, I heard it. A faint thump, like something or someone had bumped against the house. My breath caught. I muted the TV and tried my best to listen. Another thump followed, this time closer, as it came from the side of the house. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, but the words felt hollow. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and cautiously approached the window. The yard was empty, the fence casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. Then came the whispering. It was so faint. At first I thought I was imagining it, but as I pressed my ear closer to the wall, it became unmistakable. A soft, raspy voice speaking words I couldn't understand. It seemed to come from inside the wall itself. A chill ran down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped. I told myself it had to be something logical. Maybe the pipes or the wind. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I grabbed my phone and tried to call my mom. It went straight to voicemail. I tried my dad next with the same result. Of course, they were in the mountains with spotty service. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The hallway leading to the bedrooms was dark, lit only by the flickering light of the TV. But I swore I saw a shadow dart across it, quick and silent. My heart raced. I clutched the phone and backed toward the front door, my hand fumbling for the lock. That's when I heard the whispering again, louder this time, and closer. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I chose flight. I threw open the front door and ran out onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I barely noticed. My neighbor's house was 100 yards away, and their lights were on. I sprinted towards it, glancing over my shoulder as I ran. I didn't see anyone chasing me, but the whispering seemed to follow, carried on by the wind. My neighbor, Mr. Ellis, opened the door just as I reached it, my panic pounding, bringing him to the porch. "What's going on, Sarah?" he asked. There's someone in my house," I stuttered. "I think they're inside the walls." He didn't question me any further, grabbing a flashlight and a baseball bat. He called the police and told me to stay put. I watched from the safety of his living room as he and the officers searched the house. When they returned, their expressions were grim. They found no one inside, but they did find something chilling. Scratches on the inside of the attic hatch, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. The attic itself was empty, save for old boxes and a few stray tools. No sign of forced entry. No footprints in the dust. The officers assured me that the house was secure, but I could tell they didn't have any answers. My parents rushed home the next morning, their retreat cut short by my frantic messages. We installed new locks, motion-activated cameras, and even barred the attic hatch. Despite the precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been there that night.